USS O'Bannon was named after Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, the legendary Marine who led the successful attack at the Battle of Derna during the First Barbary War in 1805, which gave the Marine Corps him its line to the shores of Tripoli. O'Bannon is one of the most decorated ships in the history of the United States Navy, receiving the Presidential Unit Citation and 17 battle stars for her service during World War II and 3 more battle stars for her Korean War service. Nicknamed the Lucky O, O'Bannon never lost a man, or even had one wounded, despite multiple close-quarter engagements during her time in the Pacific. O'Bannon's keel was laid down on March 3, 1941 by the Bath Iron Works Corporation of Bath, Maine, and she was sponsored by Mrs. E.F. Kennedy, one of Lieutenant O'Bannon's descendants. She was launched on February 19, 1942, and had an overall length of 376 feet, a beam of almost 40 feet, and displaced just over 2,000 tons. O'Bannon carried a main battery of 5 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns that were housed in single enclosed mounts along her center line. She had a super-firing pair forward and 3 more turrets aft of her second stack. She was armed with 10 deck-mounted torpedo tubes, which were arranged in a pair of quintuple mounts that were located amidships. Her anti-submarine weapons included 2 depth-charge racks on her stern and 6 K-guns. For air defense, O'Bannon was initially equipped with 1 quadruple mount of 1.1-inch 75 caliber guns and 6 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. She was powered by 4 oil-fired boilers which generated steam for 2 geared turbines and was rated for 60,000 shaft horsepower. O'Bannon had a top speed of 35 knots and a cruising range of 6,500 nautical miles at 15 knots. She was manned by 329 officers and enlisted men. O'Bannon was commissioned into the fleet on June 26, 1942. After completing her shakedown cruise and initial training activities in the Caribbean and along the East Coast, she departed Boston for the Pacific on August 29th and arrived at New Caledonia in mid-September. She spent much of October steaming between the New Hebrides and the Southern Solomons on escort duty. On November 7th, O'Bannon got underway with Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan's Task Force 67 to escort a convoy carrying critical reinforcements and supplies to the embattled island of Guadalcanal. On the final approach to Guadalcanal, O'Bannon sighted and fired on a surfaced enemy submarine, forcing it to dive and evade while the convoy passed by. On the 11th and 12th, she helped to defend the transports from enemy bombers, 12 of which were brought down by a combination of anti-aircraft fire and U.S. fighter aircraft. Midday on the 12th, word came that a Japanese surface force, including at least 2 battleships, had been spotted by aerial reconnaissance moving down through New Georgia Sound, or the Slot, as it was also known. The wheels were in motion for another night action between the IJN and the U.S. Navy in the waters of Iron Bottom Sound. By 1:15 on the morning of Friday, November 13th, or Black Friday as it was soon to be known by the men of Task Force 67, O'Bannon was charging ahead as the 4th ship in Callahan's column, immediately in front of the task force's cruisers. Just after 1:30, the U.S. column made a course change to the north, soon followed by another course change to the northwest, and at 1:44 O'Bannon's torpedo and gun batteries were ordered to stand by for action. About a minute later, she reported that several ships were visible off her starboard beam at a distance of about 4,000 yards. At 1:48, searchlights suddenly ripped through the night and illuminated the light cruiser Atlanta, who was directly behind O'Bannon in the column. These were met almost simultaneously by fire from several ships in the U.S. column. However, a confusing order from Callahan that odd ships needed to fire to starboard, and even ships to port, threw the U.S. line into disorder. Her batteries, which had solutions and were tracking targets to starboard, were ordered about in accordance with Callahan's order. As a result, O'Bannon held her fire for several minutes until a target finally appeared when a searchlight off her port bow illuminated the destroyer Cushing, who was in front of her leading the column. The ship off Cushing's port bow was unmistakable due to its towering pagoda superstructure. It was the Japanese battleship Hiei. As Hiei began tearing into Cushing, O'Bannon, joined by Sterrett and the destroyer Laffey, began to engage Hiei at a range of about 1,000 yards. Every gun on O'Bannon that could was brought to bear on the Japanese battleship. The 4 U.S. destroyers in Callahan's vanguard were now separated from the heavy cruisers of the task force. After nearly colliding with Sterrett, O'Bannon cut behind her in an attempt to fall in line with Laffey and Cushing, who were heading west. As she tried to join up with the destroyers ahead of her, she continued firing until a ceasefire order was issued at 1:53 after Admiral Callahan had realized that his flagship, the heavy cruiser San Francisco, had mistakenly fired on the light cruiser Atlanta. O'Bannon resumed firing at 1:55 when she engaged several Japanese destroyers to the north of her position, and 3 minutes later she let loose a pair of torpedoes at Hiei. As her third torpedo left its tube after a brief delay, a tremendous explosion enveloped the Japanese battleship as O'Bannon's first 2 torpedoes struck home. Burning debris fell on the destroyer's forward decks, and it put an abrupt end to her torpedo salvo, as her crew held off on firing the rest of her fish. Just after 2 a.m., O'Bannon checked her fire and began to reverse her course back to the east in an effort to find targets to shoot or friendly ships. Not long after, she had to swing hard to port to avoid the shattered Laffey. Laffey's men were sighted in the water, and life jackets were thrown to them by O'Bannon's men. Shortly thereafter, she experienced a heavy underwater explosion, which seemed to be close aboard on her port side, that caused power to go out throughout the ship. This was more than likely caused by Laffey's depth charges going off as she sank. Her power was quickly restored, but several electrical circuits had been ruptured, and her 5-inch mounts were now operating under local control. By about 2:15, the 30 minutes of fury that had been the naval Battle of Guadalcanal was over, for the most part. Aside from parting shots, the forces took at each other as they departed the battlefield. O'Bannon headed on a southeasterly course to investigate the Guadalcanal coastline for signs of enemy transport ships. Finding none, she headed east, and just before 4 a.m., formed up with the other survivors of the action after finding them with her SG radar near Sealark Channel. Together, the group retired to Espiritu Santo, where they arrived on the afternoon of November 14th. O'Bannon spent the rest of 1942 and the beginning of 1943 conducting operations in the Solomons, including participating in the Battle of Rennell Island in late January. Her duties during this period ranged from covering amphibious landings, convoy escort duties, shore bombardments, and nightly patrols up the slot. In March, she was assigned to the newly created Destroyer Squadron 21, or Desron 21. In the early morning hours of April 5, 1943, while returning from a patrol up the slot, O'Bannon was asked to check out a surface contact that had been picked up on radar off the coast of Santa Isabella Island in the Central Solomons. As O'Bannon closed to about 1,000 yards off the contact's port quarter, she identified it as an enemy submarine. O'Bannon crossed the wake of the submarine and changed course to the left, putting the sub on her port bow and almost on a parallel course. The range at this point was 800 yards. The commence firing order was given, and rounds from O'Bannon's 5-inch guns began chewing up the conning tower of the submarine. O'Bannon promptly changed course and cut directly across the bow of the sub and fired off 3 depth charges, which straddled the sub. Round 2 of the fight began when O'Bannon closed again. In fact, she closed so quickly that her main battery could not depress enough to open fire. At about 150 yards, the destroyer began firing her 1.1-inch and 20-millimeter guns, and again, the submarine's conning tower absorbed most of the hits. O'Bannon turned a searchlight on the Japanese sub, and she was down by the stern, so 3 more depth charges were fired from the destroyer's K-guns. O'Bannon came around for a third attack. She returned to the spot where the submarine was last seen on the surface and dropped several more depth charges for insurance. Navy lore holds that when O'Bannon got too close to the enemy sub for her guns to fire, her men began throwing potatoes at Japanese sailors to prevent them from manning the sub's deck gun. O'Bannon's commanding officer at the time, Commander Donald J. MacDonald, stated after the war that even though he maneuvered his ship very close to the enemy, not even the crew member with the best throwing arm could have tossed a potato or anything else across the gap between the two ships. However, several O'Bannon crew members maintained that it did indeed occur, and that their skipper could not have known one way or the other, as he was on the bridge giving commands in the heat of battle at the time, and most likely, no one in the crew ran to the skipper later to boast about throwing away valuable food or spare parts. For the exacting naval historian who must rely on physical evidence, none exists, but at the same time, you can't ignore eyewitness testimony from multiple crew members who have no reason to lie about it. I believe, knowing American youth, that some items were thrown towards that Japanese sub, but they most likely fell short and had little effect on the outcome of the battle, if any at all. O'Bannon continued her duties in the Solomons through the rest of April, May, and into June. In late June, she began her participation in the New Georgia campaign. During the early hours of July 5th, O'Bannon covered the landing of Marines at Rice Anchorage on the northern coast of New Georgia. During the operation, USS Strong was struck by a torpedo, and as another destroyer moved in to rescue Strong's crew, O'Bannon fired on Japanese shore batteries that were attempting to thwart the rescue operation. O'Bannon returned to Kula Gulf 24 hours later, this time to help intercept a run of the Tokyo Express. During the ensuing Battle of Kula Gulf, O'Bannon covered the U.S. light cruisers Honolulu, St. Louis, and Helena as they engaged a Japanese reinforcement group entering the Gulf. The battle appeared to be won in the first 5 minutes, as the 3 U.S. cruisers fired more than 1,500 6-inch shells and sank the Japanese destroyer Nizuki. However, after the U.S. force turned their attention toward a second group of Japanese ships, 3 torpedoes struck Helena, and the legendary light cruiser sank about 20 minutes later. O'Bannon retired with the rest of the task force at around 3:30 a.m., without getting a chance to fight as she had been ordered, along with the other accompanying destroyers, to stay near the cruisers in an effort to prevent friendly fire incidents, which had cost the U.S. Navy dearly in the chaotic night actions off Guadalcanal during the previous year. Almost exactly 1 week later, in the early morning hours of July 13th, O'Bannon was back in Kula Gulf once more, efforting to thwart the landing of Japanese reinforcements. This time, though, she'd get in the fight. After sighting the Japanese at 1:03 a.m., O'Bannon moved in with Desron 21 and launched a spread of torpedoes at 1:10 before engaging the light cruiser Jinsu with her squadron mates and the cruisers of the task force. Jinsu was targeted by over 2,600 6-inch and 353 5-inch shells and hit by a torpedo as well and was dead in the water by 1:20. Just after 1:30, Desron 21 was dispatched to chase contacts to the west following a reconnaissance report from supporting aircraft. They didn't make it very far, as the group sent several more torpedoes into Jinsu at 1:38 to finish her off. After this, Honolulu and St. Louis each took a torpedo to their respective bows, and the destroyer Gwyn was hit amidships as well. After scuttling Gwyn, the task force retired without further action. Over the next 2 months, O'Bannon spent the majority of her time operating in Vela Gulf and around the island of Vela La Vela. On the night of August 17th, she helped sink several barges and 2 submarine chasers off the northern coast of the island. She continued supporting operations in the area through September and into October. On the night of October 6th, she took part in the Battle of Vela La Vela, which occurred in the waters north of the island. As the Japanese were attempting to evacuate their troops, Desron 21 launched a torpedo spread just before 11 p.m. Several minutes later, they opened fire on the closest Japanese destroyer, Yugumo. She was punished and left drifting, but she soon obtained revenge when one of her torpedoes struck the U.S. destroyer Chevalier and exploded her forward magazine. 2 minutes later, O'Bannon collided with Chevalier. The two ships were locked together until O'Bannon was able to back clear. O'Bannon received temporary repairs at Tulagi before sailing to the west coast for an overhaul at Mare Island. By mid-March of 1944, she was back in the South Pacific to support the series of westward-moving amphibious assaults that won New Guinea. Her duties during this period consisted of escorting convoys and conducting shore bombardments until mid-October, when she escorted elements of the Leyte landing force to the Philippines. Once off Leyte, she guarded the northern transport area and patrolled the entrances to Leyte Gulf, where she helped defend against multiple air attacks. O'Bannon operated primarily in the Philippines until June 1945. On January 31st, she helped sink the Japanese submarine RO-115. In early May, she was dispatched to Tarakan, Borneo to cover minesweeping operations and provide fire support for the Allied landings there, before returning to her assignments in the Philippines later in the month. O'Bannon rendezvoused with a group of escort carriers off Okinawa on June 17th and covered them as they struck Sakashima Gunto to the south of Okinawa. In July, she joined the Fast Carrier Task Force for strikes on northern Honshu and Hokkaido. After the ceasefire went into effect on August 15th, O'Bannon patrolled the coast of Honshu until the 27th, when she was dispatched to escort the battleships Missouri and Iowa into Tokyo Bay. O'Bannon patrolled there until September 1st, when she departed for the West Coast, where she was decommissioned after an overhaul on May 21st, 1946. From January 1949 to February 1950, O'Bannon was converted into a destroyer escort at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard and was redesignated DDE 450. She was recommissioned on February 19, 1951, and sailed for her first tour of duty off the Korean peninsula in mid-November. During the next 7 months, she guarded carriers and served as the flagship of the East Coast Blockade and Escort Group. She fired on enemy gun emplacements, road and rail supply routes, ammunition depots, and troop concentrations, and protected convoys moving between Korea and Japan. Between the Korean War and the Vietnam War, O'Bannon conducted 6-month deployments to the Far East and spent the rest of her time training and undergoing routine overhauls at Pearl Harbor. After a brief part in the critically acclaimed film In Harm's Way, O'Bannon got underway in late 1964 for her first deployment to Vietnam, where she patrolled and conducted hydrographic surveys. Much of her 1966 tour was spent screening carriers as their jets struck targets in South and North Vietnam. She was detached several times to conduct shore bombardments, where she destroyed Viet Cong base camps, troop concentrations, and small craft. O'Bannon returned to Pearl Harbor in late July of 1966, where she operated from for the rest of the year. She trained for Apollo spacecraft recovery operations in August and was a member of the Contingency Recovery Force for the Gemini 11 spaceflight in early September. She returned to the war zone with the aircraft carrier USS Constellation in 1967 and operated on Yankee Station through early November. On December 15th, she joined the gun line to provide gunfire support just south of the DMZ. 2 days later, she helped to rescue the crew of an American plane, which had been hit over the DMZ and had managed to crash just offshore. An enemy battery shelled the destroyer during the operation, but failed to score. As 1967 ended, O'Bannon was still on the gun line supporting U.S. ground forces. On January 30th, 1970, O'Bannon was decommissioned in a ceremony at Pearl Harbor beside her sister Nicholas, whom she had been built beside. She was sold for scrap in June of the same year and was broken up 2 years later. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. It really helps, and we greatly appreciate it. And if you love what we're doing, please check out our Patreon and consider becoming a member. And once again, thank you for all your support over the last year. It really means a lot.